But before I get started, welcome to the third night of our Manifest Initiative Design Making Advanced Colloquium. Thank you to our participants from previous nights for attending. We've had a really, really great series of discussions about the intersection between material practice and social practice over the course of the first two nights. And the two participants or presenters for tonight's session are going to be myself, and then Dr. Markus Wernli, who we both have been working together in a settlement called Tayo Village. And so we will be presenting on the same night so that I can give a little bit of background for our research work and a little site context, and then Markus can kind of follow off of that, so he won't have to explain all of that in his presentation. And so with no further ado, I will start sharing my screen and get into my presentation. And I think I want to be just kind of honest about this. That I think that over the course of this colloquium, I've been thinking about our discussion and thinking about my own work, and just very, very honestly, I'm taking this as a chance to try out some new ideas. So hopefully it won't come off as too much half-cooked, but hopefully it'll be a thought-provoking discussion, and we can, I've been thinking about ways to connect material practice to other parts of our social practice work, and this is what that presentation is about. So this is called Tayo Village, Inertial States and Problematizing Intervention Techniques. And as I said, I need to give a little bit of background into our work in Tayo for the sake of my own presentation and for the sake of Markus's presentation. So let's talk a little bit about where Tayo Village is, what its situation is, and the development conditions there that are kind of unique, and that's why we've been working there. So here is Hong Kong. You can see the central business district where all of my favorited places are. Over towards the right, and then Tayo Village is located on the western coast of Lantau Island, there at the little magenta dot. And it's roughly 2 hours away from the CBD by either train and then bus, or ferry and then bus. So it's relatively remote. You could refer to it as a peri-urban settlement. As we zoom in closer to Lantau Island, we can see the nearest transit points at Tung Chung, which is where you can ride the Tung Chung line, and then take a bus over South Lantau Road to Tayo Village, or you can also arrive at Mui Wo, which is over here, and take the same bus line over to Tayo. So like I said, around 2 hours from the CBD to Tayo. And as we look in a little closer, this is how that infrastructure arrives at the village. You have the bus terminus here, which is where most people arrive from. There's also a private coach arrival point over here. There's a private ferry docking pier here. Tungo Ancient Trail connects to the north of the village here. And the reason why I've called out stilt house districts is for anyone who is familiar with Tayo, either from other media or from my other presentations, the thing that Tayo has become famous for in the contemporary period is still houses, these vernacular architecture buildings that are over the Tayo River estuary and coastline that have made it famous for tourism. And we'll talk about that more later. But before we do, we need to talk a little bit about the history of the colonial period in Hong Kong and how that relates to what has happened in Tayo. So as background, once again, in 1860, the Convention of Peking ceded Hong Kong to the British Empire as a colony, and Hong Kong remained a colony of the British Empire until 1997, when it was retrocessed to the People's Republic of China and became the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, which is it's a current administrative setup. Now, what's important about this and why we're going so far back in time is because the colonial period in Hong Kong saw enactment of policies that affected land tenure. And these policies in particular affected Tayo's situation and created some of the unique conditions we see today. The ones that are most relevant are the 1844 Land Registration Ordinance, the 1890 Squatters Ordinance, the 1900 Crown Lands Resumption Ordinance, and the 1982 and 1984 Squatter Structure and Occupation Surveys. And most of these policies were transitioned into the contemporary period with the enactment of the Basic Law, which is the law that establishes Hong Kong as a special administrative region. And most of these colonial legacy policies were transitioned into the contemporary period in 1997. And when we talk about history in Tayo, I think the most important thing to understand is that Tayo was a long existing vernacular settlement autonomously developed before the colonial period. So it existed into the Qing dynasty for several hundreds of years, settled by Tanka and Hakka ethnic group people who built the stilt houses visible in the photo along the coastline of Lantau Island. I've even heard from some of the history study by some of my colleagues that if the colonial takeover had not happened, it is very possible that Tayo could have been part of the CBD of Hong Kong, Central Business District of Hong Kong, because of its size, its location next to the Pearl River Delta, and also its role in the salt monopoly. So you can see the stilt houses here. These evolved from sampan buildings that were elevated above the water and gradually evolved into these low slope, wooden framed, metal clad buildings that you see all over the village. And these are what in contemporary time really attract people to come see Tayo. This is a view from the 1960s in a book by Wong Wai King. And as I said, one of the reasons why Tayo was regionally significant was because salt production took place there, and the Qing dynasty maintained a monopoly on salt production until I actually learned that it only was officially dissolved in the 20th century. So Tayo was an important part of that. And this is all just to say that when the colonial government came in, Tayo had existed for a long time. It was a substantial player in fishing and salt production. It wasn't just a little village. It had a significantly larger population as well. And when the colonial government enacted the Crown Lands and Land Registration ordinances in Hong Kong, they established that any land use in the territory was subject to lease from Crown lands. So all land belongs to the Crown, and in order to use land, you have to lease it from the Crown and pay taxation rates on that use. And then more importantly as well, in 1890, the Squatters Ordinance established any use of Crown land without lease and payment as squatting, made it illegal and subject to clearance at basically any time. In 1982 and 1984, the squatter structure and squatter occupation surveys established the location, dimensions, and occupancy of squatter structures throughout Hong Kong, and then gave them a number and established them as surveyed squatter structures. This is the government's turn at present as well. And many of the stilt houses in Tayo, I would say most of them, if not all, are surveyed squatter structures. So they may have existed for hundreds of years even before the colonial period, but then they were established as surveyed squatter structures during the colonial period. And there are very serious constraints on what owners of stilt houses can do with stilt houses under the squatter control policy on surveyed squatter structures, which is the contemporary policy administered by the Lands Department. What this means is when the condition of a stilt house was surveyed in 1982, the occupants of that stilt house cannot deviate from that survey condition in any way without prior permission. So they have to go to the Lands Department if they want to renovate, repair, or add on to a stilt house. And permitting can take a long time and it can be very restrictive. So what has happened is effectively the development of stilt house districts has been put on pause. Any possibility of a normal or normative real estate market functioning is kind of stopped in this kind of strange stasis condition that is pretty heavily enforced. And so over time, as Tayo has evolved into a periphery core relationship with the rest of Hong Kong, in the 1970s, fishing is effectively banned, so commercial fishing is no longer viable for people living there. People start commuting increasingly into the city center for work and then returning to Tayo as commuters. And then also Tayo starts taking on a tourism role, especially in the late 20th century, and sets up this periphery core relationship with the rest of Hong Kong that is pretty different from its previous state as a subsistence fishing settlement. And interestingly, the Hong Kong government arguably enhances and increases the prominence of this role with policy decisions it makes. Tayo is actively promoted to international and regional audiences as a tourism destination through things like the Hong Kong Tourism Board, publicly funded. And so the Hong Kong government is arguably enhancing the prominence of this relationship where people go to Tayo to spend a day in the countryside, see the stilt houses and everything else. And before COVID, this was also publicized to an international audience as well as a regional audience. And this was formalized into policy in 2017 with the Sustainable Lantau Blueprint, which provides infrastructure, research, and development funding to enhance Tayo's prominence in this role as an ecological and cultural heritage district, as you can see here in the image on the right. This has been a really interesting impasse for us to look at, where the government's strategy for Tayo is dependent upon still houses as cultural artifacts, privately owned but publicly enjoyed cultural heritage objects, which it has effectively frozen in time and now is making it easier for people to come to Tayo as tourists and making that more of Tayo's role, while at the same time constraining residents, stillhouse residents' ability to participate in this change. So, you know, if you see more tourists coming into Tayo and you want to participate in that change by opening a guest house in your stillhouse, you're not allowed to. You are allowed to live there and in this kind of romanticized subsistence lifestyle, but you're not allowed to participate in the change that the government is creating for the village. So we find this to be interesting, if not a little problematic. And this is the part where we start transitioning into new work today. And I've been thinking about, so in the second section, I want to talk about inertial states. And my previous writing and research in Tayo has been a lot about construction technology and how things do and don't progress in Tayo because of the squatter policy on surveyed squatter structures. And you know, at the same time as the government is saying the still houses are flammable, this is a fire that took place, this is damage from a fire that took place in July 2020 where a still house burnt down, and this happens very frequently. There was a large fire in 2001 and in 2003. There were flooding events from Typhoon Mangkhut and Hato. The still houses are very, very fragile. The government points to this often as problems with the still houses. And part of what I've been documenting in my research is that as far as construction technology goes, people living in them have tried to improve still houses, but have been also stopped from doing so by the government. So we've seen things like improved insulation values using these composite aluminum and polystyrene panels for roofing. The image on the left side that I showed previously is a semi-composite slab poured out of concrete and steel that someone was using to rebuild a still house and then actually faced work stoppage by the lands department. On the right, we see improved vapor separation in the wall construction, as well as sealing through the use of tongue and groove paneling on the side of the buildings. So my previous research has been a lot about how people in Tayo are making autonomous decisions to improve construction technology and actually being stopped by the government because of this very complex, complicated policy condition that they face. And it makes things very difficult for them as they try to comprehend the development strategy the government has set up for them. And we also tried to interact a little bit with this by making this kind of improved footing mold in 2019. Didn't really go anywhere, but it was trying to look at ways to work with local construction networks to improve construction technology. But recently, I've been more interested in working on urban governance and questions regarding how development futures are envisioned, debated, and chosen. And I'm especially interested in how administrators and actors in the development market, how their appreciation of system complexity affects their decision-making. And the subject of this talk is about how systems complexity and how designers comprehend it may problematize provisional and developmental techniques. And that's the part that's really for designers. But before we get to that, we have to give a little bit of background on at least my understanding of systems complexity theory, which I'm sure is very truncated, and there are better experts on this than me. But what we're talking about is thinking derived from ecological and psychological modeling of complex systems like ecosystems and the human mind, and administration theory from people like C.S. Hulling and other researchers. And the premise that matters is that there are differences in the science and management of simply complex and fully complex systems. And those differences come down to differences in the epistemology, ontology, and ethics required for the science and management of complex systems. And there's differences in simply complex versus fully complex. So to kind of, again, this is all background. Epistemology refers to how we accrue knowledge and come to know what we know about a system. Ontology is about how we decide what is, and particularly what normative states for a system are. Normative meaning this is working and this is not. The system is working and this is the system not working. And also the ethics for acting and conducting science and management of a system, which is all about the moral demands placed upon a scientist or manager and how that affects their behavior. And so to kind of give a really simplistic example of this, We can look at two different systems and discuss how their levels of complexity differ and what that means for scientists and managers. On the left, we have an airplane wing, and on the right, we have a city. This is like Long Kwai Fong. I just pulled a picture off the internet. And so we can summarize an airplane wing as being simply complex, which means that in terms of epistemology, that system is bounded, and thus complete knowledge of the system state is possible, actionable, and most likely desirable. We can know what is happening in an airplane wing, and especially in terms of its ontology, it has a working state and it has one or more failure states. An airplane wing has a specific job that it's meant to do, and if it's not doing that job and performing in that state, it is failing. It is not anything else. And because of this, these characters of the epistemology and ontology of a simply complex system, the ethics for the science and management of that system can view the scientist or manager as outside of the system, and acting on that system does not have ethical implications. The engineer working on an airplane wing does not need to be concerned with how the airplane wing feels about what it does to the airplane wing. He or she needs to be concerned with if it works. In contrast, fully complex systems like urban development markets have different ways that their epistemology, ontology, and ethics work. In a fully complex system, knowledge of that system must be bounded. It is possible that any knowledge gained about a complex system is either, it may be impossible to gain knowledge, it may be inactionable to find knowledge that you can actually do anything with, or it may be undesirable to gain knowledge about that system. It may be that finding certain kinds of knowledge about a system ethically affects people within it. In terms of ontology, a fully complex system has multiple working states. If it can be said that the form, function, and identity of a city, that city can face substantial change in terms of demographic change, physical change, and still be considered the same thing. So that's different from an airplane wing. It can have multiple functioning states. And then in terms of ethics, a scientist or manager of a fully complex system cannot be separated from the system easily, and therefore the ethics of science and management are reciprocal to that system. The scientist or manager is responsible to the system because they cannot really be separated from it. So our work in Tayo Village recently, we'll return to systems thinking and all this stuff in a second. In November 2020, we proposed a pedestrian traffic monitoring project to the Tayo Rural Committee to help people who live there comprehend the tourism-driven changes that are happening in the village. And what we proposed to do was to install 8 of these, it started as 6, it ended up as 8, of these infrared monitoring gates in Tayo to count people coming in and out at certain points. These are the original 6 points that we proposed. They proposed 2 more, and help create a picture of who's coming in, who's coming out, when are they coming in by day, and hopefully provide some useful data to people who live in Tayo to comprehend the change that is happening there. And this is the solution we came up with. We have these really, really rudimentary, I actually have one here, infrared tracking gates that basically use 2 of them across a pathway, and then when a person or cow or cart or whatever passes, it registers the direction and number and time of people passing. So we also developed these 3D printed enclosures that allow us to install these gates in different locations in Tayo. And this is where a lot of the design work came in, and is in how do we, in situations where installation is not permitted, might have to happen on either public or private property, must be non-marking, must be temporary. How can we actually make this happen? Because when we ordered these things, they just come with a little 3M sticker. They don't really come with anything that allows you to install them in this way. So we developed this enclosure to make it so that we could install these monitors without creating problems with the different installation conditions, because all the conditions of those different locations are different. And this is where I want to talk about some of my previous work and some of the work that has happened in this colloquium, because I think this is a really interesting thing. There's emergence of these different intellectual and research threads in architecture and design that I think are related to the things that we're doing. The images in the top left and lower right are from an article by Alistair Fuad-Luke that Peter pointed me to about spatial activism, which was really important for me. But there's also movements like guerrilla urbanism and other interventionist ways of approaching spatial design or architecture. And Mike, I kind of cheekily put you in there too, although your work is way more permanent than mine. The image on the top right is a cabin that I built in Michigan, which is deliberately temporary. And you know, the question I had for myself in this is, why are designers and architects investing so much in temporary solutions, anecdotal and granular ethnography, and tactical responses? And what I want to talk about, and I'm going to go over time, sorry, is that I would suggest that the reason why we do things this way can go beyond constraints of means, knowledge, and permission. We were talking last night about how a lot of us work in markets where we build without permits, we build very quickly, we build with feedback, and we build for less money, and we build with what we have. And I think what I want to say with this talk is that I think there's more to it than just working with what we have, potentially, and in certain cases. And to talk about this, I want to talk about the protests that happened in Hong Kong in 2019, 2020. And in particular, so this is hopefully imagery that people are familiar with, where we had these very upsetting social and political disruptions in 2019, 2020, and even affected PolyU's campus. But the event that I specifically want to talk about is this. In Kuntong, there was, during the protests, a number of smart lampposts were destroyed by protesters using angle grinders. This is the after shot, where you have people cutting these things down and destroying them. And there's been a lot of publication about this after the fact, because these smart lampposts are not explicitly designed for law enforcement purposes. They are there for essentially the same reason that we're doing our traffic monitoring project in Taiyou. They use a video feed to count the number and type of cars that are passing a certain point in order to, for infrastructure planning and whatever else. But I think there's important things about the way that this installation signals the comprehension of systems complexity reflected by parts of the Hong Kong government. And I think technical decisions about how this was done play an important role with that understanding of systems complexity. So the questions that I would ask are whether or not decisions that scientists and managers of systems, and we're talking about urban development as a system, reflect epistemology, ontology, and ethics that show that they comprehend that system as being complex. I think the second part of the first question is particularly relevant here. Are the people who installed these smart lampposts aware that some of the knowledge that they're creating about the system may be undesirable? Again, these lampposts are not meant for law enforcement, but they use a video feed. They're not meant for facial recognition, but they surely could be used for it. And the last question I think is probably the most important one is, do scientists and managers perform as if the ethics of their work are reciprocal to the system they're working on? And are management decisions, like installing a monitoring device, acknowledged and performed as if they are experimental? And if we look at the embodied energy and labor energy of this installation, I think the answer is definitely no. The techniques of this do not signal experimentality or reciprocity. It is expensive, it requires permitting, it requires complex technology to install. The data that comes from this does not go to anyone except for the planning department. And that, I think, may be related to the political response that happened in the destruction of these lampposts. So, and again, just to reiterate, these are not for law enforcement, but they certainly were perceived as being for law enforcement. So when we look at our response in Taiyou, and I want to be really, really clear about two things. One, the concern over facial recognition was voiced by stakeholders in Taiyou when we proposed this project. So that was on their minds too. Two, this solution is far from ideal. We've faced equipment failure and theft and cows running into things and all this other kinds of stuff. And I think we finally have it dialed into where the monitors are not getting ruined and they actually work. Here is our data. We have data that shows that tourism traffic increases over the weekends. We have data that shows that some ways into and out of Taiyou are more balanced in one direction or the other. But what I want to talk, this is my conclusion, what I wanted to bring to this discussion in the colloquium is a hypothesis about certain technical aspects of the kind of work that we are doing. And one thing, one hypothesis I have, the first one is related to things internal to the discipline. This is kind of referring to that term facility that I brought up with Clint the other day, and I want to kind of explain it a little further. I think that architects and designers are interested in facility as a measurement of the capacity to manifest material and spatial thoughts, whether through drawing, visualization, organization, or craft. The idea of facility is you can go from ideation to materialization quickly, develop feedback from materialization, and feed it back into ideation very quickly. And I think this is something architects and designers are always interested in. Mark West writes very well about it, where he talks about making chalk drawings. And the reason he got into fabric formwork is because he was looking for a building system that was permanent but worked the same way. It gave him immediacy, facility, and feedback from thought to materialization. So I think within the discipline, part of the reason we work this way is we're interested in that. But I also think in certain cases that architects and designers may be interested in comprehending space and development markets as fully complex systems. And this may inflect our reciprocal ethics in what we do. It may be why we're interested in ethnography, why we're interested in talking to people. And most interesting to me, I think a lot of these things about our intervention tactics, our techniques of our work, the fact that it is impermanent, the fact that it is light enough for people to carry, the fact that it is not permitted in a lot of cases, could be a position rather than a weakness. It may be that in some cases we are trying to foreground the fact that our work is experimental and ensure that we are performing on an urban environment as an experiment in order to develop reciprocity with that environment rather than enforce any kind of will to power or all these other problematic things in architectural thinking. So that's the kind of half-cooked thought, is that there's more to it than just not having enough money or the technology that we want if we position the work the right way. And I think that's the thread that I'd like to tease out further. Thank you. That's it. I went quite a bit over. Sorry about that. So with that, I can take questions either on the presentation or anything I said, or whatever we want to talk about.
Thank you, Daniel, for this very profound introduction to this type of life design lab, if we want to call it that way. Isn't there a certain frustration coming along when we work in this temporal way, when things are not really manifesting for that long? At least that's from my point of view. That's what I experience in my work, and that will come through in my presentation.
I think frustration, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that I'm always suspicious of anyone who says that they get things done as too much of a virtue. I think on one hand, we've seen a lot of work in this colloquium where the satisfaction of completing something is sourced kind of in the right way. It's coming out of the interaction from lots of different people and meeting conflict, meeting dissensus, and finding ways to move forward anyway. I think Peter made a really important point, is that participatory design as a way of thinking of design research implies complete consensus. And I think we all know that no design process proceeds perfectly in that way. We never reach perfect consensus. I think that part of it is being open to being surprised about the directions the research will take, and not letting frustration eat you up too much. I mean, I definitely am super frustrated with some of the conditions that we work with in TIO. For instance, it's like Mike and Clint and Peter, I'm watching all of you, and getting building permissions in Hong Kong is impossible. There's always some reason why you can't do one thing or another. I think it does push us. I think we have to have, we do need to show results as much as we can, but that shouldn't override seeking the conversation and seeking the ethnography as well. So I think it comes down to will to power. How much are you willing to, not you personally, but how much is a researcher or an architect or a designer or an activist willing to let their will to make something happen override other things? And that's a complicated question. It does mean that we can face a lot of frustration.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point that Markus raised. And thanks, Daniel, for the presentation. It just got me thinking now about this idea of temporary things and what the impact really is if they're temporary. And that's why I spoke about activity and not activism. So I just thought that a temporary thing can be generative. You know, even if it doesn't last very long on its own. But if it's generative in terms of policy or even the smallest shift or being seen as a precedent, which might kind of generate other interventions or other shifts. So I think that the temporary can have impact beyond itself.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the complicated question for me, or the most actionable question in terms of design is, you know, as we think about, like, just taking those trackers, for example, as we think about making them better, you know, and I want to be really, really clear that we're still dialing in the technology. What does better mean? And I think, you know, especially with some of the things that have happened in Hong Kong with smart city in particular, one of the most suspicious things about it is that better starts to approach almost omniscience in comprehension of the city. All data is good, more data is good, more precision is good. It doesn't really matter any ethical implications of this. And when I think about progressing from early design to better design, finished design, it's interesting to me to think about permanence is not always better. Knowing more is not always better, or knowing everything is not always better, or being unstoppable is not always better. I think, you know, there's an argument about the idea, if brute force doesn't work, you're not using enough, if you've ever heard that phrase. And things that are temporary allow for reciprocity in a way that things that are permanent don't. And so it's like, not only can they initiate things, but they also allow other things. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, the other thing that I think that I thought of when you showed the image of the monitoring pole being sort of was the idea of power and control. So we obviously had our own set of protests not long ago. Roads must fall and fees must fall. Where and one of the key events was when protesters asked for the removal of the statue of Cecil John Rhodes on campus, and there's a Rhodes Memorial up the hill, and someone went in with an angle grinder and cut off his nose, which was quite funny. But anyway, so he's a problematic figure for many reasons, but here the removal of the statues was a removal of this symbolic power and this privileged position where the statue was kind of in the center of campus. And these monitoring poles, similarly, they're quite intimidating things by the looks of it. And they kind of say power just by what they look like, never mind what they embody. Whereas I think your monitoring devices are much less imposing. And I see there was a kind of a thing probably saying what they're about, the little laminated note. So I think it's a lot about how these things are presented, and obviously also what the data is used for and how it's used, and kind of the transparency of that.
Yeah.
These things are obviously highly centralized, the data processing and use, and who knows what happens with it.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I think it's also striking, if you live in Hong Kong for any amount of time, you're struck by differing notions of the word temporary. You know, what the government is willing to consider temporary. Entire playgrounds, entire bus depots, entire public restrooms will be labeled temporary, et cetera, et cetera. And especially when you think about the enforcement of temporary building technologies, that's the language they use on stillhouse owners, when many of those stillhouses have been there for hundreds of years, actually hundreds of years, that house has been there. And if they want to renovate it, the residents have to use quote unquote temporary materials. And it really is all about the power relationship. It's all about whose permanence matters more than what permanence actually is, because the government is perfectly willing to build a concrete bus depot and tear it up tomorrow if they feel like it. But that's on their agenda. And they, at the same time, you know, even a moderate amount of concrete used in a still house is not allowed. It's striking, really.
Daniel, regarding the data that you're generating with the traffic monitors, what is your plan? How do you make it accessible to the population?
Yeah, so we've been messaging that data to Leslie Ho, and I guess this is also one of those things that I always have to make sure that I say. There are a lot of other actors in Tayo who are trying to deal with that situation. It's not just us. There are the Tayo YWCA, the Tayo Fei-Mao Li, organizations that educate school children, organizations that run geographic tours. So I just want to emphasize, we're not the only ones who kind of comprehend this. There's lots of people working there. But the YWCA is an important partner for us, and Leslie is the project supervisor there. Every week, I personally go to Tayo, check the monitors, get the data, and send it directly to Leslie. Leslie sends it to the Rural Committee and to a community Facebook page that is posted about Tayo. And then also in the future, I'm looking at my notes here where I was talking about this with Markus and other colleagues. In the near future, we're going to make some posters that kind of show this information. There's also, I'm working on a prototype with somebody who knows how to actually make electronics that will allow a display on site that makes it easier to access the data for anybody, as well as being multilingual. Because Mike, that little laminated card is meant to show the data, but it's kind of, we can do better. So we're working on that as well to hopefully make it so that access to the data is immediate.
Hey, Dan, just a little story. Our Institute project last August to December, we had a little project in Yunlong, which started out as a temporary structure we did with some Hong Kongers, like 10 non-design students. And the idea was to actually do some kind of rebuilding using urban waste, basically, of a temporary structure. What we found, we ran into a whole bunch of problems, like you mentioned, but one of the interesting things was the fact that there is this category within law, like if you have certain kind of agricultural structure, you're allowed to build certain things. And like you said, it has to be sort of non-permanent things, cannot be in masonry, for instance. And then we figured out that actually one of the ways, this was in the back of Yunlong, so it's like a rural area, but we figured out one of the ways to monitor it is through drones. You know, they fly over, or aerial photographs, basically. And when they find, you know, modifications to, say, village houses, then they send somebody over there to look. But the interesting thing was, if you look very closely at the laws, at the rules, then there is actually grounds for modification. So, for instance, sort of loopholes within the law. So, for instance, if we didn't have permanent foundations, or if the foundations weren't connected to the actual structure itself, we could bypass some of these things. In the end, our project changed, and we did something that's inside the existing rundown village structure. But you know, it may be worth to have a look into some of the loopholes within the temporary structure laws in Hong Kong.
Yeah, that's really good information. Markus, you hear that?
Yeah, I know that. Actually, I live in the New Territories, and this is like container heaven. People build all kinds of structures with containers, even restaurants and bars, and it's considered temporary. And so you can put them anywhere you like and can stack them 3 or 4 containers up. Yeah, they're not really suitable for this climate because they're basically ovens, and if you know you roast inside, and you need heavy-duty air conditioning to get them going. But because they're considered temporary and removable, you can build all kind of structures, and they can be hanging out for decades.
Well,
And shape the landscape here a lot.
Yeah, for instance, what we were going to do is actually build a self-supporting frame. And we looked at different options, one which has this kind of peg holes cast into concrete in the ground, so it's not permanently attached. And then it seemed like that wasn't going to be possible. So then we thought of, all right, let's stay with the self-supporting structure, but we've got to make sure it doesn't move under a typhoon. So let's have the whole structure anchored down by weights or connected like a tent. The tent would have been a bit on the margin. So then we were thinking, okay, let's just have this counterweight sandbags or weights or water bags hanging off the structure to load it up so it's not going to fly away. So, and this thing's maybe arguable within the context of the law, but I don't know if that's useful for you, but it's just some kind of weird gaps within the kind of law.
Yeah, they're always there. Honestly, there's always something.
Daniel, thank you for your presentation. It's quite rich, and I really appreciate it. There's quite a lot of depth to it. I also obviously have a bit of appreciation for the for the temporary, which I think what's quite interesting is this question that you raised, or someone raised, like who's temporary and who's permanence. And I think that working in certain settings, I mean, the temporary can be of value, and I agree. It's definitely with regards to reciprocity to kind of figure out sort of what the next step is to do. But there is also obviously the value of the permanence, but somehow trying to find ways of suspending the permanence, because I think if working with certain groups, for me there's also sort of this kind of fear, or sort of the ethical concern around treating subjects as experiments, and we sort of go in there and it is just temporary. I mean, it kind of echoes to the anecdote I was explaining the other day, where the one gentleman stepped into the library and then kind of looked at this temporary space, and he was just like, we're only good for this kind of thing, experimental sort of things, and also this, for architects not to be measured by actual buildings or that we build. So how do we carefully construct what are the outcomes that can be produced along the way, and that is then foregrounded as valuable. I know in our case we specifically kind of really withheld the idea of a building as a promise, that this could be a certain result. And it was I think what was quite interesting, in the library, we had a survey done, and everybody that walked into that space wanted that temporary structure to become permanent. Everyone in the community, it's like a list of comments. The person who didn't want it there was actually the manager. So that raises the questions, who's temporary and who's permanent, and this is the real reason why they didn't want it in there, because it required the staff to get up and just like walk around maybe every 30 minutes to go around the corner to make sure. And they didn't want to do that, right? So it's again this kind of the inertial states, how do we change it? And so I think that whatever we do, if it's temporary, but how does it sort of become a sequence of temporary events that somehow at least sort of changes the trajectory of a particular inertial state. So in our case, yes, I wanted the thing to remain permanent in that place, but because this woman was persistent, we broke it down, and it started to make us think, okay, how does this thing find, you know, another kind of presence or some kind of permanence in the community? And then, you know, somehow not being too precious about that particular structure obviously started to develop into something that became this sort of shack. And what I think is also quite interesting about this, even, I mean, the shack's there, but, you know, I think the one thing that a lot of people forget is that's actually still a private property. So it's still kind of very delicate, you know, if anything can happen, and then, you know, then it's, you know, so it's still a kind of a temporary sort of thing. But I do think, I mean, you don't have to respond, but I think it is how does one's temporary moves at least, you know, changes the trajectory of an inertial state. So how does it, like in our case, instead of being persistent of changing this particular person's mind, we found another kind of conduit to kind of get our work to go forward, but not necessarily in a building. Like the process kind of still continues. So, you know, other people started to take part of it, and it's kind of took on a life by itself. And there was this other kind of authors that sort of carried sort of the work. So yeah, that's just kind of what I wanted to say. I think there is, I think as well as we kind of experiment, for me, as you still got to somehow keep your eye on what could potentially be permanent, you know, like.
Yeah, I think kind of implicit, I'll make this last point because we're running out of time, if that's okay with everybody. You know, I think kind of implicit in what you're talking about, or related in the Hong Kong context a little bit more, is something I'd like to talk about, which is an idea that I think architects have not completely reconciled, which is, and this is probably coming out of the fact that real estate development as an industry is, it's referred to as hegemonic in Hong Kong, where almost everything that happens is in the context of that industry and what it wants. And real estate development, commercial real estate development, has an idea called present value. The idea is that land and space has a certain value, which is a function of interest rates and demand. And essentially, it's more a question of how much money you can get for using the land in a particular way in a particular time than any other architecturally relevant uses of words like function or use. Okay, so exchange value over use value. And I think part of that is interesting, and this is partially come to terms with in books like Spatial Agency, is in more permanent work, I think techniques of labor and how design can affect them does matter, especially in the context of the idea that at some time in the future, a real estate investor may decide that the property they built something on is more valuable as something else, and the building should be torn down. You see this all the time in Hong Kong, where a building will go up in a year, exist for 5 years, and go down the next year simply because more money can be made by building a slightly larger building. And so I think one of the things that architects can comprehend for more permanent buildings in that context is that even things that are meant to last have implications for material waste and also material cost, labor cost, and embodied energy because of that phenomenon of present value, especially in places like Hong Kong. So I think there are aspects of these making-driven, technical, and agency-driven arguments that we have that can apply to more permanent things. It's also a matter of how they're codified and made into building code instead of just our kind of bias and interest. And also whose agency matters after a certain amount of time. Like if you look at Norman Foster, he starts his career very interested in how light can it be, how demountable can it be, how small can it be, how easy can it be to put together. And that is still true of his later buildings, but it's diluted by the distance between the design and the visibility of whether or not the laborer's agency matters in taking that apart or putting it together, whatever the case may be. So I think summing this up and ending here, one of the things that came out of that spatial agency article is the idea that temporal and distance relationships in contracting and design have power, imply power. And so, you know, Charlie's talking about being on site. I'm talking about being on site. I think that does matter. It makes a difference in who's who the impacts. Sorry, when there are impacts of technical decisions on people, when those impacts matter, and if they are visible. And I think that's part of what we're coming to terms with. That should probably be the end, unless anybody has a last point, because I don't want to be the last one to talk. But we're at 22 minutes. We should probably move on soon.
There's a question that was messaged regarding technology.
Yeah, role of the technology with local TIO society, what you propose the traffic monitor, how to change the role positively for local community or society. I don't fully understand the question, but I mean, we have had some fairly positive interactions with people who are in TIO about the project. The rural committee, we gave them our data last week and they were impressed with it. They thought it was really good for them to be able to anecdotally note things like more people come on the weekends, but now they can prove it. They can prove how many people go over the Tayo River Bridge or over the Sun Key Bridge and apply for funding from the government and everything else. There has been lots of kind of anecdotal interactions with the technology and with people, you know, because I'm the one who checks it. And so everybody's seeing who's this redhead every week showing up and doing stuff in Tayo. And, you know, positive and negative. I have people who kind of check in on me. We say, good morning. It would be very different if I spoke the language, and I'm going to work on that someday. But, you know, there's negative interactions too. At the Lungtin Estate crossing, where we had a monitor, it was deliberately messed with for weeks. Someone was breaking open the enclosures, turning the monitors around so they wouldn't read. You know, it was really, really clear that for whatever reason, somebody didn't want that to work for a while. That's apparently stopped. I don't know why. We are also gluing the enclosure shut, so it's probably just too much hassle. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you. Anything else before we move on to Markus? Okay, let's go ahead and let Markus present. I'll stop talking. And Markus, whenever you're ready.
Okay. I try to share my slides. Can you see my slides?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, so I must introduce myself very briefly. I'm not an architect. I don't have an urban planning background either. I have more an artistic background. I would say I'm a social designer, and I do more kind of probiotic design, as I call it. So I'm interested in to engage with life processes to manage life processes, and life that includes a community, that includes people. So I have been working the last year on ecological community enabling sanitation approaches. And I haven't gone that far yet. Nothing has been really manifested, if I want to be honest. It's been so far only turned out to be 3 probes that I'm gonna talk about tonight. Okay, so Daniel already made a very nice introduction around the context. So we find ourselves here in the Pearl River Delta, and there's Tayo on Lantau Island, which is basically just a mountain range away from Hong Kong Airport, fairly rural area. This blue arrow on the bottom indicates the tidal stream, which is kind of important for this project. Another view, we had already very nice views on Tayo. This is an aerial view on Tayo. We can see on the top, and it's covered up by the tidal, we can see float prevention wall. And then further on the top left, we see the former salt pans. As Daniel indicated, Tayo was important for salt production. You can also see that there is a forking river here in this village. And then on the bottom right of the image, you can see mangroves. We have mangroves still growing here. And the mangroves also play an important role for the project that I'm presenting here. So another view here on the current stilt house settlement that we have here. So that's an attraction on one side. There are also very fragile buildings that are in this semi-legal state. That is quite making things quite complicated. And from my experience in engaging with the residents, there's a lot of mistrust among the residents towards government or anybody authoritarian, because the status or the possibilities are so limited for stilt house owners. Okay, aspect that I'm looking into is the stilt houses that are not connected to the public sanitation system. So there's various systems that are in place. There's drainage systems that the government offers. There's septic tanks, and about a third of the stilt houses are not connected to the sanitation system. And what you have are these outfall pipes that are just going straight into the marine environment. And there are a number of ethnographers who are writing about it for decades, or tourist bloggers. It's quite common when you're at the waterfront that you hear some splashing from pipes, and then you can be assured that it's coming from kitchen or from toilets, washed straight into the marine environment. And then I had conversations with residents about the situation, and there's interesting justifications that people have, and indicating that the situation cannot be changed. That's that for one, we have streams, coastal streams that are very strong, and so it's washing away, so we don't have to worry. Fish will gobble it up. There are supposedly scientific reports that indicate that the water quality is okay. And then there are others. When I talk to the rural council, the local government, there are people concerned because some of the scum is actually washed into the mangroves, which upsets people, and then pesticides are being used, or mangroves are cut down altogether. That's kind of a common occurrence in Lantau, in the northern part of Lantau, that many villages are cutting down the mangroves because that's where the pollution is accumulating, and then they become just a nuisance. Where on the other side, mangroves of course have very important ecological functions for wildlife, but also for protecting the coast. So when I started the project, I started more from an artistic vantage point and was like, what if? Isn't there a possibility if we could just connect these open outfall pipes and we just install some sort of platforms that have a constructed wetland on a very small scale with a biofilter on it? So it was like, yeah, this could maybe work as a way of putting out a pilot. Just to explain briefly as a backup, what is ecological wastewater treatment or agroecological? It's basically you build in filters where the wastewater is approached as a resource to feed algae or fish, to feed it into landscape restoration. You could extract biofuels out of it and energy, or you could feed or irrigate grassland and create livestock, or you could make it part of a multi-cropping system. So there's recent debate on considering wastewater as an agroecological asset. So this past year, I've been in collaboration and in strong exchange with various experts, mostly biotech people or ecologists. And depending on the stage of this project, I rely on different expertise. So I had countless Zoom meetings around the world. And yeah, I started off last year with a funding application, which started out with the question, what if the water could be in a more decent quality where people actually could go out and swim again, as it was the case historically or some time ago. I find out through ecologists, marine ecologists, that actually the water control station nearby is not that nearby. It's near the airport. It's 3 kilometers away, so there's no real record on the water quality in Tayo. And so, building on a deficit, I put together a research proposal that had 3 elements in it that included collective dye tracing, DIY water monitoring, and DIY bacteria monitoring that would enable local residents to get a better grasp on their aquatic interaction with their environment. So, based as a community science project, I was thinking that a dye tracing activity could include 20 unsewered households, and they would release at the same time a color dye, a phosphorus color dye that is harmless to the water, but it's very impactful visually, and that could be video streamed through drone footage. And that would indicate where actually the pollution hotspots are in this quite complicated waterway system that we have in Tayo. And this would then indicate where certain water quality remediation could take place. I'm interested in fermentation. I'm interested in microbiology. So I collaborated with a microbiologist and looked for ways to introduce digestive, effective microorganisms through clay soy balls that would be released into the water and that help the digestive functions inside the water and help take out excess nutrients from the water. And there are some cases where it has been successfully implemented around the world. And so we wanted to set a precedent in Hong Kong as well. But then in the end, when I had an exchange with the Rural Council, it was indicated that we have a problem with these mangroves. And there are supposedly excrements floating around Tayo. And so some colleagues at my school also pushed me and said, hey, Markus, why don't you go back and go into your field of eco-sanitation and do something with toilets? Why do you stick on just monitoring the water environment? Why don't you actually work at the source of the problem? So I came up with another probe, which is just a conceptual model where I did a brief inquiry about what would happen if we said we're building a urine economy. Urine is excessively released by the local population. It contains most of the nutrients released by the human body. It's relatively easy to capture and to stabilize and made into fertilizer. And so I connected with local farmers to see if there's a willingness to use urine and so that we could create a demand and would create a value chain because there is a farm nearby of Tayo on the other side of the bay, EO farm, where human waste could be actually processed. And it could be used safely for ornamental cash crop production. But this project didn't go far, and I didn't have the capacity to really be persistent enough and build on this. This will take years to build up, I think. So I looked for something. This is a sample for urine economies actually working. There's a sample in Vermont in the USA for the past 10 years. also rural environment where they use large amount, they collect larger amount of urine, they pasteurize it, and then they fertilize grasslands and produce fodder and hay for cows and cattle. I did also a successful urine upcycling project in Hong Kong a couple of years ago on a smaller scale, and used it for educational purpose, where local Hong Kong residents upcycled urine to close on small scale the food loop, their food loop, and saw how their eating habits would influence the plants that they would grow out of it. I did in the third probe that was eco-toilet oriented. I was looking for a solution that would work and integrate with flush toilets. Flush toilets are a standard. People just take it as for granted. The advantage of flush-based toilet is that the water inside the toilet creates a natural barrier. And so it's something that I have to respect. And also stilt house owners or residents in Taiwan, they use flush toilets. And so I was looking, and I was remembering that when I traveled in Brazil, in the rural environment there, that I came across this Wernli filter, earthworm-based biofilter system that used excess wastewater from septic tanks that had overflows, and that had a specific biofilter that turned the overflow, the black water, into gray water, and the gray water would end up in a mulch bed and feed banana orchards. And then I reconnected with my friends in Brazil, and I looked deeper into this system, and then I noticed that currently also the EU has a quite big research project going on in eco-sanitation, where earthworms are implemented. They call it not earthworms, they call it lumbri filter. And in Europe, there's also sanitation disconnects in rural areas, like in Ireland, in France, in Italy as well, where they install these systems and they put it indoors because of the winter season. Worms cannot operate at temperature below 12 centigrades. So together, in collaboration with my permaculture friends in Brazil and with an environmental engineer in Germany, I looked for downscale that system and make it fit into what I call sanitation garden that could be implemented in Taiwan and that could float. So I set up a system that would work with a flush toilet, with a small cistern, 4.5 liters, that would be enough for a 4-person household. We would have a 200-liter drum with earthworms that are living inside wood shaving bedding, and beneath there would be a layer of gravel, a layer of clay pebbles, and then that gray water that comes out of it, there's quite a fast thorough flow that would enter into a leach planter that has oyster shells, that has sediments, and that has moisture and nutrients absorbing plants. So this is a system that works entirely with natural forces like gravity, earthworm digestion, microbial digestion, evaporation, and the photosynthesis of the plants. So it doesn't work with any external energy input, and what we could control is the gray water that comes out of the barrel and the cleaned water that comes out of the leach planter with a very simple handheld monitoring device. And I talked to heritage architect who has a long experience working with stilt house builders and residents. He helped rebuild some of the stilt houses that were burned down in a fire about 10 years ago. And he told me that I have to be very careful about the tides. They are fairly high tides. Daniel indicated that some of the stilt houses can be 100 years old, or even if they're just 50 years old, what happens is they have stilts that are not being extended while the seawater level is rising. I just learned recently that since 1930, seawater level has been risen by 2 or 3 feet in Hong Kong. And so what happens is that when there's a high tide, a spring tide, a full moon tide, or even a typhoon tide, that floodings and inundation of these stilt houses that are most remote from the shore are inundated. So this makes ecological sanitation quite tricky. And this is a drawing that this architect made for me. And he said, hey, you have this backflow. What do you do? That cost me some sleepless nights. And I was thinking, like, what can I do? So first of all, I looked into how can I use the approach of a floating sanitation garden, and how can I borrow formal elements from the Tanka culture, from the native fishermen or fisher people culture that's called Tanka. They have this tradition of cultivating oysters on these floating platforms, for example. And so I made some sketches for a unit that combines a toilet plus the sanitation garden, because I realized that the existing pipes, I cannot take care of it if I want to treat them in an ecological way. So I created this unit that is self-contained and that has a pivoting arch bridge here indicated in yellow that would go up and down with high and low tide. We have a diurnal tide in Tayo, which means within 24 hours we have 2 high tides, and the difference is about up to 6 feet. So that's quite a challenge. This is a sketch that would indicate what this looks like. Yeah, and then the next step was going around, trying to find a volunteer, trying to find a stilt house resident willing to experiment or willing to tolerate this system and test it in a pilot installation. And the pushback was very strong. People said, yeah, this looks good. Oh yeah, this could work. Does it really work? Oh, doesn't it smell? What are the problems? I ended up talking to a boat builder in Tayo, and he said, well, it can be done. Oh, and you have a budget? Sure, that works. But you will need a license. You will need to go to the Marine Department, and you need to demonstrate that this is a boat that works and that doesn't sink. And he said, it's very unlikely that I get that license because there is no precedent. So for me, at the end, it was like, okay, ecological sanitation is not only a right, but it's a privilege in this. It's a big challenge. So here are these 3 probes that I did over the past year. A bit of an overview. So the citizen science has the limitation of being just symptomatic. Urban economies need a big base of generosity to take off. And this activist structure of a floating combined toilet and sanitation garden is a high exposure venture that's in this kind of risk averse environment where residents mistrust the government and don't want to stand out, is maybe a bit too much to swallow at this point. So what do? I need to change my strategies. And I'm looking now to reconnect to my farmer friends and take this system out into more safer farm environment and have a farming family trying it out on a safe ground, so that we can build a precedence for it and gather experience. And then on the other side, I'm in the process of connecting with curators. So this project could become part of an exhibition. That's my plan. All right, and then space for your questions.
Thanks, Markus. Do you mind turning your camera on for question and answer?
Sure. Yes.
Thanks. So I'll let others chime in. So yeah.
Thanks, Markus. That was very interesting. I really enjoyed it. I'm glad you're planning to build a prototype. I was thinking while you were talking whether you could do one on a boat that's moored somewhere that's static, so you don't build your own structure to start, but test it on a boat. But if dry land's probably better for a start, I guess.
I agree.
Yeah. I've also worked with a few systems. Some of them you might know, the biolytics system, which is also a vermiculture one. We did a development here in South Africa. It was a high-end development, but they were compulsory for all the houses. I'll just put a link in there.
If you could send me some documentation, I would appreciate.
I just put a link to the website in the
fantastic.
chat.
Yes.
Yeah. So I only know they needed quite a large area. So it's also vermiculture, underground tanks, and the water that comes out is used for irrigation, but they needed quite a large area to irrigate. So that was the one challenge. But they're still working really well. They've been, a few of them have been in there for probably 10, 15 years now.
Mm-hmm.
So they've been working well. And yeah, obviously the people prefer flush toilets. I was thinking of composting toilets, which I've also used. The EnviroLoo was the one I used, but you need quite a lot of input and community buy-in. But then I also thought of a precedent. I don't know if you know it. It's an African architect called Kunle Adiemi. He did the Makoko floating school in Lagos, which I think also ties in with this these conversations we've been having about temporariness and permanence. I'll put a link of the one article in. So the first, he did a floating preschool with a triangular structure, which unfortunately sank, but he's now making improved prototypes, and he's done a few throughout the world, so it might be worth a look, but also quite an interesting project. And he envisions like a whole suburb of floating buildings in Lagos.
What did he do about the sanitation? Do you know that?
I don't think there was any sanitation on the preschool. I mean, I've never looked out for it, but I'm just looking at the one image and I don't see a toilet. So I don't know how they deal with it there. So there's a whole suburb in Lagos that's on the water. So similar situation to Tai-O, I guess. But yeah, really interesting stuff.
Yeah, Markus, I can't help but think, you know, I included in the brief for this colloquium the idea of not only social or political, but also institutional inertias. And I'm curious, you know, not that we want to spend too much time reflecting on our research environment, but also I'm curious what your opinions are on the priorities that are set for research and how different research models impact your ability or inability to do your work. Because, you know, when we talk about that question of frustration, developing buy-in, prototyping, it seems to me that there are different kinds of criteria for the work you're trying to do that are harder to gain traction because of the university environment as well as Tai-O. So I'm curious if you have any reflections on that and can relate your experience in terms of what are priorities, what are not priorities, and how that affects you.
Well, actually, I wish I had my own garden. I wish I had access to, you know, a compost pile, or I would love to set the precedent myself. But right now, I don't have that. I don't have the space. So I find myself in the boat like many other Hong Kong residents, right? Who are in very constrained sites and don't have access to this, to any natural environment. So I struggle with that. But I'm really interested in why I want to pursue this Wernli filter, this earthworm-based filter, is I want to, earthworms are an animal. Earthworms are a living being, and they need regular input, and they happen to love excrements, and they like to feed on toilet paper. So the system is kind of peculiar that it only works for like a domestic setting. It won't really work much for a public toilet, because like a hiker's toilet or a camping toilet, because these toilets may be abandoned for a week or 2 or 4 months if nobody shows up, right? But for a household that is inhabited, that's an ideal situation we have for this earthworm-powered system, which connects the resident with this non-human element, taking care of them to a certain degree by just excrementing. So I'm kind of fascinated in setting up this link and this consequential connection. And I think in Taiyou it could make sense. And I would like to, support that in any way possible. So what I'm looking right now is to find a farmer's family that actually will regularly use that toilet. And so in order to build this relationship, that's what I'm looking for. Now, as you mentioned, the university that we are at is not very supportive. We have a farm, an urban farm, and the sustainability office, but they're not interested in supporting this project at all at this point.
There's also an interesting, and you referred to this in your presentation, but could you maybe elaborate a little bit? There's been some partial provision of sewerage, right? So I don't know if you could kind of explain that further for the people here.
So what is interesting is Hong Kong has, of course, wastewater regulations, and there's a strict law that for regular households in Hong Kong, you cannot release black water. It needs to go into the sewage system. But then we know, and Daniel elaborated on this colonial heritage, there are certain specific privileges for village households that leave them out of these regulations, and they can go without enforcement, and they don't have to oblige with these regulations, which is interesting. It's going on for decades like that. So that these regulatory exemptions, where it's just tolerated that black water is running out. Yeah. We have to understand that marine or nutrients pollution is a huge problem in the Pearl River Delta. And so if Taiyou residents say, well, it's flushing away, you can be assured that from another village on the other side, from Zhuhai or from the mainland, there will be nutrients flushed in or pollution flushed in, of course. So it's kind of a not in my backyard kind of attitude, right? But I'm not interested in that kind of governmental aspect. I'm interested in building up trust in the community, at least with some adventurous minds, in order to set a small precedence. I think with relatively small intervention, a change can be exemplified here. That's what I'm interested in.
And it's interesting too, and I think one of the things you and I have discussed too, is that the precedent is set in other countries. I mean, there's like you mentioned, in Brazil, South America, other parts of the world, there's precedent for using this technology in this way, right? It's mostly just that it hasn't been, and you also, I think one of the things that's been really interesting that you brought up is that there's history of this kind of cyclical agroecological way of using waste. Would you mind talking about that a little bit? Or?
So, yeah, in the old days, actually, in Chinese culture, in the Pearl River Delta, there was a tradition of reusing human waste. Now, it was not the most sanitized way, it was not the most pleasant way, and there was class interference and power dynamics playing in, where the dirty work has been done poorly paid, but there was at least a tradition of resource reintegration. So there was no waste. And there's specific techniques on the coastal areas to actually collect human waste and in order to solidify it and then turn it eventually, dry it up and turn it eventually into fish food or into aquaculture food. So it has this long-standing tradition, but that has been lost. I think it's kind of complicated. Of course, there's colonial history. British colonialism comes also, of course, with a certain sanitation and hygiene regime that has been implemented gradually in Hong Kong Island in certain areas, but not across the board. And then we have these dependencies on this water-based sanitation system. And in Hong Kong, there's an interesting twist with that, because we like flush toilets, but Hong Kong notoriously has shortage of water and needs to import most of the water from the mainland. There's a high dependency here. So about 80% of flush water in Hong Kong is coming from the sea. So it contains salt, which means that the wastewater is deemed not a resource, but just as waste. It eliminates the possibilities of using it purposefully in agriculture. And also, earthworms will not like it. They don't like salinity. So for the system that I introduced, we need to bring in fresh water. That's also interesting to see how engineering decisions actually then foreclose the possibilities of upgrading the system.
Hey, Markus, this is coming from a bit left field, but I mean also possibly relating to your previous experience. But a long time ago, then I did a installation. This was in Sweden, so in Stockholm. And then we built this thing, and the city, it was for a cultural event, like architectural cultural event in 1998 or something. And then the city couldn't figure out how to place it, how to situate it, because it was temporary. It wasn't kind of architecture. It wasn't really art. It was somehow, it wasn't a festival. It was somehow between all the categories. And then it was quite interesting. It wasn't an easy process, but actually what we ended up doing, because we, you know, this was a city sanctioned or a, you know, acceptable kind of cultural event. So that then what the city eventually did was they rewrote their building permissions law. So they made a new category for that was acceptable for our one-off thing, which has since been used and enshrined in the law in Stockholm, as far as I know. No, I don't claim any huge achievement from that, but it's just that sometimes these things may have a different way into the public perception and have a degree of acceptability that coming from something like a cultural side may leverage open certain possibilities. Now, I don't know if Hong Kong is fluid or flexible enough to do that, but certainly, I mean, Casey Wong, for instance, you know, he's a kind of activist, political artist who does this kind of installations and so on. He definitely makes use of this kind of little bit of a gap between categories to leverage his own installation art into. So I'm just wondering, I mean, it's, of course, I understand what you're doing is very technical and somehow relates to daily household use and has a kind of engineering component to that. But I'm just wondering if there's a way to position some of these things or parts thereof as a sort of prototypical thing that would actually be able to be situated within cultural change.
I mentioned that I would like to collaborate with curators or maybe art spaces. So it could turn into an installation that could be functional within an art space.
Well, even I was thinking not even an art space, but some kind of event space within, like, art installation within Tayo, for instance. You know, my family lives in Tasmania, and there's a museum there called Mona Museum, and this guy, he's European, I think he's German actually, or Dutch, and he make this digestive system in the art, in the museum. He's quite well known, I've forgotten his name. But anyway, so he makes this thing, and it's commonly called the poo machine in this museum. And then it basically is 24-hour digestion thing, or permanent installation. And it attracts a huge amount of notoriety because then it reflects back on individual consumption and waste production and so on. You know, I'm not suggesting it go that way, but I'm just wondering, like, would there be room in other kind of situations outside of the actual real implementation of this as a sort of stepping stone?
Interesting thought. I had this exchange with this heritage architect, a local heritage architect, and he told me that he has plans of doing an exhibition on stilt houses, and he would love to maybe include this as a proposal for the evolution, for more ecological evolution of stilt house architectural settlement. So there's maybe some avenues that can open in that regard. Yeah. Other than that, I'm not familiar with cultural spaces in Tayo, so I think I have some work to do, some more research on possible openings. Yeah, it needs some, I agree, it needs some openings, it needs some room where it can take on its own life.
Just for the purpose of naming other people who are doing work in Tayo, the architect, and Markus had this in his presentation, is Gary Young. And, you know, again, just making sure it's known that we aren't the people working there. He's a very significant scholar on stillhouse architecture, published in the Hong Kong Institute of Architects journal, as well as his own book, all about stillhouse architecture. So if you hear Markus or you hear me speaking about stillhouses, a lot of that knowledge comes from Gary Young and his work. And he's also actively involved with first Habitat for Humanity and now other groups in doing stillhouse renovation projects. So a very significant body of work there that is, you know, way before us, before anything that we've done. So it's good to know he's out there and doing that work.
Yeah.
So just another question for Markus. Markus, why did you go for an individual system, like one toilet tank and outflow, versus have you looked at doing a communal one where individual toilets are fed to like a barge, for instance, with 4 tanks in a larger surface area?
I have thought about that. The space conditions are quite restricted. And I would like to start small, I was thinking, because I have no experience yet. We haven't tried it here. I've seen it running in Brazil very well, but we need to first look at how it works here. I have a bit worries about the warmth because it gets quite hot here. And here it can be like 37 degrees centigrade, and it's very humid. I don't know how the worms will survive. So we need to start with a small trial.
You might need to insulate the tank.
Yeah, we have to do some sort of cooling. Yeah.
Peter, anything to add? Sorry, I just saw your mic was on. Okay. Any other questions from the audience? Clint?
I'm walking outside, so sorry for the noise. But you know, I've been following you guys now for the last 3 days, and I mean, it's wonderful to actually see that you guys can share intercontinentally this level of problems, because basically it does come down to that. It's different conditions, but society is grappling with issues, the built environment is grappling with issues, you're dealing with issues of who has right to change, you know, even if it's a right to have access and use a toilet. I'm just wondering what can you guys, well, first it's a pity you can't be in one space and actually do projects together. The next question, of course, is what are the outcomes and the capacities that you draw from this in order to, you know, make the next steps? Is it maybe putting all of the work together to profile it? Is it maybe a way to, I don't know, to come to some sort of material conclusion? Because usually these colloquia are really great, but people lose momentum because, oh, it's done, I can go and have dinner, I can drink beer. But what I'm hoping that from all of this, at least you guys can get some sort of, not only link going, but some sort of dialogue that keeps on running, and that studios will be run in the same way like Markus's project would be done. I'm walking in, I'm thinking, wouldn't it be amazing if Markus's toilet can go to South Africa and test run there, and go to Indonesia and be test driven there? I mean, yes, we are living in COVID, but we could also see other possibilities come out of this. So that's at the very least that I'm hoping that you guys can extract certain agreements and certain concrete ideas and build on that and actually help each other through all of this as a collaboration. It doesn't add much more to the discussion. It's more pushing people to commit to some sort of outcome. Yeah, over and out.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a discussion we go through over, you know, the next couple days and weeks. I think that we have, first off, I think we have a lot of content here, and we have the video of these that's going to go online. And I think I'm going to ask each of our contributors to send your presentation to me, perhaps maybe ask for a small bit of writing, see if we can't find a way to create a publication out of this that can kind of keep the larger conversation going. I think that there's also been, as I was alluding to in what I was talking about, and I think came up in almost every single interaction between contributors, is that there are larger threads that relate all this work to other kinds of design research and other kinds of public administration research or social sciences research. And I think that you know, it'd be good to have reflection on how those things relate, and maybe bring in even other researchers to kind of contemplate that. So maybe we can kind of pull in colleagues from other disciplines who can look at this and see what they see, even though it's a conversation amongst designer, artist kind of people. But yeah, I think that's an important point. Markus, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, certainly some articulation would be beneficial. I started to put up this project now onto my website as a first step to generate a bit more interest. During this journey that I took, I connected with a group called Ecologists Without Borders, and they mentioned that they would be very interested in seeing this system used in other stilthouse communities. There are stilthouse communities in Cambodia. They have stilt houses on 10-meter high stilts. Also no sanitation there. So there's maybe possibilities that it could travel. Yeah.
Well, also myself and Markus will actually talk to somebody later on this month, I hope, in Hong Kong about a possible project. So we are looking into that. We don't know yet what that involves, or whether that's possible, but yeah.
Excellent, good. So we are nearing the end of our time. I think probably, since we don't have any real cap on this, I'll give each contributor a chance to give their last thoughts, and then we'll kind of conclude the session. So, you know, no particular order. Anyone have any last things they'd like to mention or say about the colloquium as a whole, or, you know, thank you, Markus, for your presentation first. I think it's time to head towards our conclusion. So Clint, Mike, Peter, Markus, any parting thoughts as we end the colloquium and these 3 days of discussion?
Maybe just to say thanks for the initiative and for organizing it all. I think it's been really interesting. And I think there've been lots of intersections like between all the speakers and different aspects of everyone's work. They're kind of really interesting networks and links between the projects and kind of also the writings that have been shared so far. So yeah, just to say thanks.
Yeah, just from my side also, thank you for the opportunity to be able to share the work. And especially, I think, you know, being, I wouldn't say fairly new, but, you know, doing this for the last few years, I mean, I think, you know, for me, I've been able to actually, you know, for the first time, really kind of locate, you know, where the work sits, with, you know, what group of people it actually sits with, you know, so I think that was incredibly valuable for me. And I think, you know, what's quite interesting for me, you know, a commentary to everyone's work is this sort of this subversive practice that seems to be apparent for me anyway in everyone's work. And then I think, you know, this sort of interdisciplinary way of working, I think I'm particularly fascinated by Markus's work today in terms of him being a designer and just, you know, the persistence of just working with all these other different people to try and get something going. And I'm obviously interested, you know, also to know how, you know, working with those different people shapes him as a designer, and how even possibly that can be a way of rethinking how to connect with that particular community, because that's kind of what seems to be the biggest blockage sort of in his work in terms of just trying to continue the experiments. But overall, I think it was really fascinating. There's some interesting terms that was thrown around, which I haven't thought about, and interesting definitions that have actually allowed myself to explain some of my work a little bit clearer as well. So thank you everyone for participating. Incredibly valuable.
Thanks, Clint. Markus, Peter?
Apologies that I was not attending the last 2 days, that I was only here tonight. And also apologies that my presentation was quite raw and not really conceptualized much. At this point, I'm still grappling of what happens or what has happened. And I'm still dwelling in this kind of frustration. And I feel like I need to build better. Yeah, I need to work on building up trust in that community, and it will take some time. And sometimes I'm a bit desperate about generating data or pure research, and it's kind of messy out there in the field, and I'm not there yet. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity. I think it's very nice. Just two suggestions. I mean, one is a bit like Gerhard said, it's very nice to have a kind of very open platform for these things, you know, something that actually propagates, you know, cross-fertilization of different ideas, intersections of different thoughts and different approaches. And the fact that that can be, you know, I think we're all very aware of authorship, affiliation, you know, and all of these things. But, you know, the fact that we share these things in a kind of open platform way, open source kind of open platform way is actually really, really nice. The second thing is that following on from that, maybe that it would be great to have a follow-up or series of these things, right? So it doesn't just become a one-off, right? Maybe there's future dialogues with others involved and so on. You know, and that would be super interesting to grow something like this. But thank you.
No, thank you. And thanks to everyone for participating, and also thanks to Charlie in absentia. You know, he couldn't make it tonight because of the time difference, but I think he was a really great contributor too. And, you know, to Charlie's point, or not Charlie's point, Peter's point, sorry. To Peter's point, I think, you know, first off, I'm going to follow up with trying to create some, you know, packaging content of everything we've done here. But I think also one thing that might be kind of interesting is to maybe start conducting another session on an invitation model, or, you know, you could call it a pay it forward kind of model, where each contributor is invited to invite someone else, and kind of we can work together to frame the next conversation around people we see near us who have related work, or you know, not necessarily around the same subject. It could be related in a different way. So in the next coming weeks and months, I'm saying it on video camera, so it has to happen. I'll do some work to try and organize the next session and keep this conversation going. I think it really has been a really nice, like I said last night, it's great to see people who do like-minded work at the very least. You know, and especially seeing interactions between that is very fruitful, I think. So yeah, it should continue. We will work at that and try to make that happen. I'll be emailing you all to kind of keep going on that. And with that, I think we can conclude tonight's third session, and we can conclude the colloquium. I think I personally have learned a lot. I've been really excited to see more of people's work who I do know their work a little bit, and see new work that I'm not as familiar with. And I really, just one last time, want to say thank you to each of our contributors. Thank you to people who have attended as audience members. Thank you to people who have helped organize and initiate this. Thanks has to go to Gerhard, of course, Gerhard Brains, for connecting me with Mike, connecting me with Clint, getting, you know, initiating this in the first place. So thank you to everyone who helped make this happen. I think it's been very worthwhile. And with that, we can conclude for the night. And please watch the School of Design website, YouTube, and social media for the videos, which I will ensure they are posted. And we will send out the content in as many formats as we can think of.